Our next session will be on May 15th, where Krista will share a different approach and perspective to embracing grief and cultivating gratitude. We invite you to participate in our other PD Health at Home events that includes Wellness Wednesdays and Fitness Fridays. Join us this Wellness Wednesday for the continuation of our expert briefing series, Understanding Gene and Cell-Based Therapies in Parkinson's. While still in the developmental stage, genetic and cell-based therapies hold some promise for people with Parkinson's. This expert briefing will review what those considering gene-based or cell-based therapies may expect in terms of symptom management and disease progression. We welcome you to learn more and register for our other PD Health at Home programs by visiting parkinson.org/pdhealth. Lastly, if you are new to Parkinson's or are embracing a change in your journey, please do not hesitate to reach out to us. We have a comprehensive website that addresses everything related to Parkinson's. Visit parkinson.org or call our helpline at 1-800-4PD-INFO or email us at helpline@parkinson.org. And now I'd like to welcome back our facilitator for today's session, Dr. Taylor Rush. Thank you so much for being here, Dr. Rush.
Thank you, Danielle, so much for having me. Hi, everyone. I love all the activity going on in the chat over here. We've got people from the West, the East, and everywhere in between, and I'm so grateful that you chose to spend some time with us today. So for those of you who have seen me on this program before, again, I'm Taylor Rush. I'm a health psychologist out of Cleveland Clinic, and I work very closely with our Parkinson's Center of Excellence. So I see a lot of folks with Parkinson's disease and try to help them work through various emotional, behavioral, and cognitive parts of managing Parkinson's. And today I was thinking a little bit about what I wanted to discuss with you guys. And I thought maybe we could spend a little bit of time discussing self-criticism. And, we all have an inner critic, it's part of being human. And it was kind of created out of survival needs back in the day when we were running and fighting lions and tigers and bears. We needed to, have a watchful eye out to make sure that we stayed safe and out of danger. And, today, most of us aren't running from many lions and tigers and bears, but self-criticism can take a lot of other forms instead. And the volume and intensity of that voice can certainly vary depending on the person. It can be influenced by upbringing, by what others tell us, by past experiences, whether it be success or failure. And I will say in my work with individuals who have Parkinson's, I work with this particular topic quite a bit. I mean, even in just the past week alone, I've talked to quite a few people who were dealing with a pretty strong inner critic related to their Parkinson's symptoms. And, that can vary in terms of, criticisms that they may have about physical decline or shifting roles that they're experiencing or symptoms of depression or anxiety that they're feeling or grief related to a future that now may look very different than they initially had envisioned. And what I noticed is that a lot of the emotion associated with self-criticism is born out of comparison. It's when you realize you can't be what you've always been, or in some ways are not going to be able to be what others have expected you to be. And people struggle to accept that they're not necessarily the same. And you can't just work harder to make it happen. And for many people, they find that they end up spinning their wheels the more they criticize themselves. And then on the opposite side of things, I also find that while positive thinking can be really helpful for adaptive coping, sometimes it can end up being its own toxic criticism. And people will say, gosh, I've got to be positive. I need to be upbeat. I'm doing something wrong if I'm not being optimistic. I'm going to bring others down. So the self-criticism ends up working from that angle too. So what I may often hear people say is I need to find ways to quiet that inner critic. And often what I end up saying is, actually, I think you need to lean into it a little bit more in order to better understand it. And where is it coming from? What is the purpose of this self-criticism? Is there ways in which it helps, or is it only there to serve to make you miserable? Because, sometimes we need to listen to some of that self-critical voice. Sometimes it may be telling us something that we don't necessarily want to hear, but need to hear. And, not everything that we should listen to and learn from is necessarily loving or kind. Sometimes there are facts of a situation that we need to hear, even when it's really hard. So self-criticism can sometimes serve a purpose. It can help us to self-correct a behavior that isn't necessarily adaptive, or accept things that you can't do anymore. Sometimes we need to better understand, is this possibly something larger as part of depression? Is it, part of self-loathing that maybe we've internalized over the years that really is starting to get out of control, and I need to maybe talk to someone about it? And, what I often find is, when we think about mindfulness, right? Part of it is how to be in the present moment. And this is the caveat, without judgment, right? And so self-criticism often comes when judgment is introduced, when there are feelings of guilt or shame or concern about how we are affecting others. And so something that I'll often ask people is this inner voice potentially telling you something that you need to hear? Is it helpful? Is it realistic? Would someone else that you know and trust say the same thing? Or is it maybe its own animal that needs to be looked at in terms of how it may not be serving you well? And so, an example, I had a patient who was previously an ultra marathoner. They had always been, incredibly athletic. They were elite with running and had run for pretty much their entire life, up and through, their 50s and their 60s. They would place or win in pretty much every race they would participate in. And they were very, very healthy, always took care of themselves. And then they were diagnosed with Parkinson's. And as the Parkinson's progressed, they found that their body was moving a bit slower, and they found that they were no longer winning. They weren't able to beat their personal best or records within their age group, and their performance began to wane over time. And what I find is often that most of the highly self-critical individuals are usually also very high achieving, but they don't necessarily always enjoy their accomplishments because it's never enough. It's always on to the next. What else can I do? What else can I accomplish? And there's nothing wrong with having goals, but sometimes if you don't savor the moments of accomplishment, you end up just comparing it to what you want more or what needs to happen in order to, get to the next step or the next level. And it kind of goes back to that old saying, comparison is the thief of joy. And so for this individual, they really struggled that they would never be good enough again because their sense of identity was so highly linked to achievement. And so what they ended up doing is they would actually drive themselves even harder to try to do better. But what they ended up doing was making some of their Parkinson's symptoms worse and causing some physical injuries. And so we really kind of dug into what was fueling that, and there was a lot of long-term perfectionism, some high achieving tendencies that had kind of dated back to childhood. And for them, it really kind of linked to a sense of control. If they could win something, then they could control a situation, or so they thought. And so we really tried to work on how to harness some of that self-criticism and take away the judgment and see the fact that, okay, the truth is that they were correct in telling themselves they couldn't keep up with their personal best records. That's a fact. And that their time was going to slow as a result of Parkinson's. It's also a fact. But instead of it being, just a fact, they were adding all this judgment. So we worked on how to reduce some of the judgment so that they could take care of themselves better, so they could actually enjoy the actual activity of running. And we've talked about this before in terms of cultivating acceptance and being able to experience joy in everyday life, is that how can we be mindful in order to, enjoy what's in front of us rather than what we wish could be or should be or was. And so I think that instead of trying to silence our inner critic or trying to, pretend, it doesn't exist or only try to think happy thoughts, we need to recognize some of what it's telling us and whether or not some of it might actually be helpful. Again, is it telling us something that we need to hear, even if we don't want to hear it? Is it potentially helpful information? Is it realistic? And would someone else that you trust say the same thing? Can you learn from the experience? Can you learn from some of that narrative? But also try to let yourself off the hook a little bit. And so, one example that I like to give is, so for me as a psychologist, I've been through a ton of performance reviews in my training, in my job. You're constantly getting feedback about how you're doing. And so I kind of think about my internal critic as, something that can give me feedback. And I know in one of, I've had some really good performance reviews, and I've had some that I'm like, I don't know that that one's so great. And I don't know that, the feedback I got was really all that helpful. And what I find is that, often we appreciate honest, constructive feedback that improves our sense of insight, our performance. If I get too much positive feedback, I'm like, oh, great, I'm glad that I'm doing some stuff well, but what can I work on? What can get better? And then if I get too much negative feedback, it can feel bogged down and defeated. And so, to have a little bit of positive, but also something that's constructive, I think is important when you're getting feedback from others, but also when we're giving feedback to ourselves. So if we can be able to find a balance with that inner critic, sometimes we can harness it so that it can work for us rather than solely against us. And through that process, we can sometimes harness some of those core attitudes of mindfulness, of acceptance, non-judgment, being able to let go, and being able to engage in non-striving, not trying to make something different that is unable to be different, but seeing it for what it is. And so I thought that we would do a little bit of a meditation practice surrounding how to maybe tune into that inner critic a little bit, but also how to manage some of those tendencies that maybe some of you have, that it ends up being a bit more negative or derailing or sometimes overwhelming. But how do we get it to, again, maybe channel to work for us rather than against us? So if you would like to join me, let's go ahead and get comfy in our chairs here. And wherever you find yourself, sitting or laying down, just trying to make sure that your back, your spine, your hips are well supported. And as with most meditation practices, you can either close your eyes or softly fix your gaze somewhere in front of you. And slowly begin to tune in to the breath. Just being able to observe the physical sensation of breathing. Noticing your posture settling in. And it may take a moment for the mind to find itself able to settle just on the breath. There's always 1,000 things to divide our attention. And for some, you may already notice some self-criticism creeping in, even when we try to settle on the breath and our brain doesn't always want to cooperate, we start thinking, I'm really not so great at this whole meditation thing. Why don't I actually do this more than just on Mondays at 1:00? But that's actually the voice I want you to try to pay some attention to. That inner critic, that self-judging peanut gallery. And I want you to maybe slowly consider reflecting on an area of life where you might feel judged, where you might criticize yourself. Whether that be at home, somewhere out in public, or in a role that you have as a partner, a parent, a friend. Just reflect on what some of that self-critical voice says in that scenario. And you may notice that it's more than just a thought that you have. It may affect how you feel, both physically as well as emotionally. You may notice that your body tenses up. You may notice that there's an increase in tremor, and maybe that's what you're criticizing. You may notice that you almost feel a bit more uncomfortable or stressed as a result of paying attention to the criticism. But if you're doing that and that's what you're feeling, it's kind of the point of this practice. So good job. Just take note of what those physical and emotional sensations are, because that could also be a cue for you the next time you find yourself in a self-critical cycle. A cue to maybe take a step back and take a deep breath. And if possible, imagine stepping away from this inner critic and almost seeing it as a separate entity from yourself. Don't wrestle with the thoughts. Don't try to make it better. Don't try to push it away. Just see it for what it is. And imagine if you were saying this to someone that you care about. Is this self-critical narrative helpful? Is it realistic? And in some cases, there may be parts of that. But if imagining saying it to someone else is overly harsh, how might you be able to see the situation differently? What might you say instead to that person that you care about? And how would it feel to try to say it to yourself? And if some of this becomes a little overwhelming or uncomfortable, again, that's okay. You can always transition focus to the breath for a moment before returning to it. And just be with your emotions, your body, recognizing there's nothing that you need to fix or change. Non-striving, acceptance. recognizing that sometimes the inner critic has important words to say that help us move forward, help to encourage us, that it can serve a helpful purpose. And sometimes it may get a little overzealous. Sometimes we need to call it out and be able to recognize that we're spinning our wheels. And recognizing that narratives are fluid. The things that we say to ourselves can change. Just because we think it doesn't always make it true, but that's why we can mindfully be aware of it to determine if it's helping us or not. We have the space to manage that. Allowing your breath to provide that space. Allowing yourself to see your narrative for what it is. See the inner critic as a watchful partner that sometimes can get carried away. Transitioning more fully back to the breath. Noticing how your body feels now. Sometimes putting the spotlight on that inner critic can be a little stressful, but then after helps us to let go a little, or at least shows us some areas where we can continue to work on letting go. Open-heartedly meeting yourself where you are right now. And when you're ready, start to move your body a little bit. Your back, your shoulders, wiggling those fingers and toes. Coming back to a more active awareness of the room around you. Opening your eyes if they've been closed when you feel ready. Okay. So, everyone's starting to come back here. Hi. And for our usual flow, I'm certainly inviting anyone to add to our chat as far as how that experience went, any questions that you might have. I think we did already get a few, so we'll start with those. So one person made a very good point. They said that don't forget that external criticism comes from doctors themselves. We need to trust the medical community, which is not always affirming. And we could do a whole talk on that. I completely agree. I think that sometimes the people that we need to trust the most, and often that includes our medical providers, sometimes may have some words to say that are not always the most sensitive or affirming or validating of the experience that you're going through. And one thing that I will often tell my patients who come in with that concern is that, one, unfortunately, it's a reality that we all experience from time to time. And it doesn't make it any easier, but it happens, unfortunately. But two, sometimes it says more about their own inner critic than perhaps it says about you. And so, sometimes we need to remember that, but also that perhaps that's an opportunity to have a conversation with your medical provider about how it lands. And they may not even realize that it lands the way that it does. And so if you feel comfortable or trusting enough of that provider, being able to give them that feedback, because I often do that with my medical colleagues. We do communication trainings, and we talk about ways to talk to other people and how to demonstrate compassion in a meaningful way. So give them that information. They're human too, and they need to hear it. Let's see, what else do we have? Oh, I like this suggestion. Someone said, try and start with the absolute smallest project. Doesn't matter how small, accomplish it, and then praise yourself throughout the day. So sometimes, that inner critic can really act up when we think we have something big that we need to do. We're like, oh my gosh, there's just no way, I can't finish all of this. It's not going to happen. And so I love that suggestion, because it's often something that I will also recommend to people is, what is the lowest hanging fruit that you can possibly pick off this tree? Because the entire tree may just seem overwhelming and insurmountable. But if you can start with the lowest possible rung of the ladder, oftentimes, that can at least get the process started and the ball rolling in a way where we can encourage ourselves a little bit more. And some of what we thought wasn't realistic ends up being much more doable in those small chunks. So, and then someone had said, I had not considered that I could learn from my inner critic. And yes, and that's the way that I try to spin this on its ears, because I think we're always like, oh, the inner critic, it's bad. It's not something, we should pay attention to. But really, it's a part of us. There are certain parts of us that sometimes are a little bit more tough love, and sometimes it gets a little carried away, or a lot carried away. And so I think there are ways in which we can learn from it and use it, not always. And sometimes we need to step back and realize that some of it can be detrimental and toxic, and it may come from past experiences that were really, really horrible. And it's not even us that's saying it, but someone echoing from our past. But there are other times when we can tend and befriend a little bit with some of this. Let's see, someone said, I think, is imposter syndrome a kind of inner criticism? I believe for many individuals, yes, because it's this idea that I'm a fraud and people think I know stuff, but I don't know that I know half the stuff that they think I know. And I will say that I have long suffered from imposter syndrome, and I'm just starting to come around to the idea that I might know something. And so I fully believe that. And so I think it keeps, I think I can use that to keep me on my toes. I'm always trying to read. I'm trying to stay up to date on literature and the latest and greatest. I think it makes me better in that way, but I also need to believe in myself and my skills. So I think we all can sometimes wrestle with that a bit. And then let's see, what else? Good to think about an inner critic, and when appropriate to answer with, I'm doing the best I can. Yes, sometimes the simple responses are the best. And even when, the inner critic is throwing a bunch of shoulds at you, and that's, this is, it's a famous line from a psychologist that said, you should, and you end up shoulding all over yourself. The shoulds end up weighing us down. They end up really undermining our potential. And so being able to say, should schmuds, like, I'm doing the best I can. And that is good enough. And let's see here. Kindness is a gift to give ourselves. It helps me to remember that my new limitations are not necessarily a bad thing, so acceptance is important. Yes. And someone asked, is it crazy to have internal team talks? No, no, absolutely not. I often volley between a few different voices in my head. I don't think that's abnormal. I think for many people, they have more than one narrative at any given time. Sometimes we have the rational narrative, and also the worried narrative, and also the one that ends up, sometimes helping to solidify both. And so, I think it's often the case that we try to look at things from different perspectives in order to get a fuller understanding of what's going on around us. Okay. So let's see. There's some people saying I'm doing the best that I can. And let's see. And someone had said that to bring focus to the inner critic left them feeling anxious and need to come back out of that. Going into darkness needs active reversal back to light. And oftentimes when we do end up focusing on inner criticism, it can feel very heavy, especially depending on what that voice is and where it comes from. And so sometimes we need to do that within the safety of talking to someone else who can help us ground. Sometimes we need to do, something that otherwise grounds us afterwards. So we may need to go for a walk or get some fresh air, or watch something funny, or do something that helps us to come back to what's going on in the moment when we go inward. And sometimes for some people, it's a very overwhelming experience that it's best done with a therapist rather than by themselves or with someone else, so that they can learn the skills that they need to do that effectively. So absolutely. Okay, so I know we're at time or over time, and so I want to make sure that we respect all of your time and your day. But I again appreciate you guys so much for being so interactive with these sessions. I so look forward to them every month, and I really look forward to seeing you next month.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rush. Let's close things off with everyone giving yourself and each other just a pat in the back. You did good today. So thank you again, and we shall see you next week.